On August 16, 1983, a trenching crew in Prescott, Arizona made a discovery that should have belonged to history, not a murder mystery. A human cranium, animal bones, and a time capsule buried together beside a building. For more than 4 decades, the man beside that strange time capsule had no name. In 2026, DNA and forensic genetic genealogy finally identified him as Edwin Ed Mowrey, a Vietnam veteran who vanished in the early 1970s. In 1970s Arizona, Edwin Ed Mowrey was the kind of person who could easily disappear into the margins of a small-town life. He was a Vietnam veteran, and his family later said that, after returning home, he lost contact with them in the early 1970s. He was also known as Eddie or Ed, and the later identification restored not just a legal name, but a person with a history, a family, and a place in the world that had gone missing for decades. What makes this case so haunting is that Mowrey was not a mystery because nobody cared.
He was a mystery because, for years, there simply was not enough to work with. His disappearance happened in the early 1970s, and by the time his remains were found, investigators were dealing with only fragmentary skeletal evidence. That meant there was no easy path to identifying him, and no obvious public record tying him to where he was eventually found. Then came the day everything changed. On August 16, 1983, workers trenching along the southwest side of a building in Prescott uncovered a human cranium, a collection of non-human bones, and a time capsule. The placement was unusual enough that investigators initially considered the burial possibly historic in nature. The presence of the time capsule made the scene even stranger. It suggested age, context, maybe even a way to date the remains. But it did not answer the most important question: who was he? Investigators estimated the remains belonged to a white male between 30 and 40 years old at the time of death. Because only limited skeletal material was recovered, they could not estimate his height or weight with confidence. The case was entered into NamUs as an unidentified person, and for decades that is essentially what he remained: a file, a skull, a set of notes, and a question that did not let go. Over the years, the case moved through the ordinary systems that try to solve extraordinary problems. Investigators searched for leads. They compared missing person reports. They preserved the evidence and kept the case open in hopes that some future development might finally give them a way in. But the central obstacle was always the same. The remains were limited, the timeline was old, and the identifying information simply was not there. That is why this case went cold. It was not because the discovery lacked importance. It was because, in 1983, the tools available to investigators could only take them so far. Without a match to a missing person report, without a dental confirmation, and without the kind of advanced DNA analysis that exists today, the investigation had to wait for a breakthrough from the future. For more than 40 years, that breakthrough never came. Then, in 2025, the Yavapai County Medical Examiner and Yavapai County Sheriff's Office submitted skeletal remains to Otham's laboratory in Texas for advanced testing. Scientists extracted DNA and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a profile suitable for forensic genetic genealogy. That work created new investigative leads, and those leads eventually pointed to one answer. The man found beside the time capsule was Edwin Ed Mowrey. The identification was not just a technical achievement, it was a restoration. According to reporting on the case, Mowrey disappeared in the early 1970s after returning from Vietnam. The identification gave his family confirmation after decades of not knowing what happened to him, and it turned an unknown set of remains into a real person again. A veteran, a son, a relative remembered by people who had waited far too long for answers. Still, Even with a name restored, the case is not fully solved. The biggest remaining unknown is how Mowrey ended up buried where he was found. Officials have not publicly explained the circumstances of his death. The discovery itself was unusual, but the records do not provide a complete account of what happened between his disappearance in the early 1970s and the recovery of his remains in 1983. There is still no full public narrative for how he died, why he was there, or whether anyone else was involved. So today, the Prescott John Doe case has moved from "Who is he?" to "What happened to him?" That is a different kind of mystery, but it is an important one. One name is back, one family has an answer, and one long-forgotten man is no longer anonymous. What remains is the silence around the final chapter of his life, and maybe that is the part worth sitting with. After all those years, after the strange discovery beside a time capsule, after the DNA work finally gave him his name back, there is still so much we do not know about Edwin Mowrey's last days. What do you think matters more in cases like this? Finally identifying the person, or eventually uncovering how they got there?